remind yourself that you're still valuable, even though you can't do anything.
Hello, investor, and welcome back to another episode of the Passive Income Adventures, where today we have Annette Munroe talking about everything from the nitty gritty of running a business and bookkeeping and little hacks to make that more efficient, to growing up in poverty and how we are looking at our ability to fight poverty once we get into a position where we don't have to work anymore and we can start turning those efforts that we were pouring into a job or a very needy business and start being able to look at ways to improve the community around us. So, if this is something that interests you, figuring out how to become financially free so that you can have more philanthropy in your life, it's definitely going to be an interesting. This is definitely an interesting episode for you. But at the same time, something we talked about after we pressed stop was how to have more fun on the show. And we started laughing and giggling and talking about moving around more and just making the podcast a little bit more personable and a little bit more entertaining. And that is something that I have been working on as I've kinda got my feet under me. We're just finishing up our first year of podcasting and getting into having things be a little bit more free because I wanna deliver a lot of value. I wanna deliver a lot of education, nuts and bolts, nitty-gritty, and inspirational stories, but at the same time, we're funny. We love to tell jokes. We love to laugh. We love to just be silly and talk big with our bodies. And so if that's something that you would like to see as we're talking to our guests, go over to our YouTube channel and check out our podcast over there on at Passive Income Adventures, where we also share little shorts of some of the adventures that we're going on and some of the silly stuff that we do. So if you want to see a little bit more of that entertaining, fun side of what we do, because sometimes I know the podcast itself can be very heavy with either educational topics or heavy with some of the issues like Antoinette and I were talking about today with figuring out how to fight poverty. Life is made up of both sides, and we want to be able to share both with you. So, coming up live with Antoinette Munroe. All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We have Antoinette Munroe from Orlando, Florida. I met Antoinette at the Bigger Pockets conference, standing on the stairs networking because instead of going to the classes, we were talking to people in the hall, which is what this business is all about, is networking. So thanks for coming on the show, Antoinette. I was really impressed by your story and how your vision and your mission really fit with the purpose of what we're doing here on this podcast, is which is teaching people how to stop worrying so much about money and then the other more worthwhile things they could be worrying about if they weren't worried about money.
No, definitely excited to be here. Thank you for having me. Yes, we were hallway pimping hard at Bigger Pockets. We probably sat on the stairs for like 30 minutes just talking about stuff, missed our whole session. So it was great.
Yeah, I find that that to me is a lot more valuable. My sister texted me after the show and she said, I was thinking of going, but I wasn't really sure. She said, which classes did you like best? I said, I didn't have any classes. I was there to meet people. You were one of the people that we met, and it was so fun. We had a follow-up call. I guess this is also key when you meet people at a show. Write down their name, write down their number, actually follow up call. So we're sitting on a call. I think it was Halloween, and I mentioned that we were looking for a neighborhood to go trick or treating in because we're traveling and we didn't know where to go. And you said, "You should come down to my neighborhood. It's an amazing." And it was amazing. Like, the whole block was like, the whole area was just over the top. The kids had so much fun. So thank you for that. And it was so good to meet you in person again.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad you guys came. Halloween is my favorite, especially since I moved to this neighborhood. They are absolutely insane. So
Yeah, it's so fun. And you weren't really feeling very well. So I really appreciated you coming out and showing us where to go and helping us out. Cause I mean, it was definitely memorable Halloween experience.
good, good.
Yeah, so let's just jump into your background, your history. Tell us a little bit about you and how you got started on your financial freedom journey and kind of the turning points along the way that were really impactful on your life.
I think the biggest thing that was impactful was that I was poor, right? And you're either going to go one of two ways. You're either going to repeat the things that you're seeing in your environment, or you're going to figure out how to make sure that the rest of your life doesn't look like that at all. So the biggest impact for me was learning from some of the negative examples and experiences I was having as a kid and wanting to build a life that was going to be completely different than what I had experienced up until that point. So for us, I'm not an athlete, so I couldn't like play a sport or anything to get out of the hood. So I just went to college as far away as I could, but still within the state of Florida. And in college, I
Mhm.
majored in business. I think I've always been oriented towards business, just being a little money hoardy, wanting to save any allowance or babysitting money that I got, just because all I understood at the time was not having money. So it's not like I knew what I was doing or there were any underlying principles there. I just knew spending what you don't have or spending too much was bad. So I was a thing. And in college, went to business school. So it helped give you some type of framework for business. But again, it's not like college is it doesn't really teach you how to run a business. The only way you're going to know is to do it. I went to college to get out of my parents' home, and the goal was to get a job so I didn't have to go back and that I could build a life for myself from there.
That's interesting that you're talking about your saving habit from lack of money because I hear the opposite true as also true from people that the less money they have when they get a dollar, they spend a dollar. And I heard something recently that really hit me where it talked about the superhero villain, that interaction, because superheroes and villains often have the same types of traumatic backstories where something sad, bad, dangerous, whatever happened to them and the superheroes go on to think, how can I help other people so that they don't have to go through this? And the villains, the same thing, go in and they're very vengeful and resentful and they go around making trouble. So, what do you think was that difference for you versus going down, say, the villain path? Like you said, you either copy what you see or you do the opposite. What do you think is the difference there for people who say, I don't want this, I'm going to go down the superhero path?
I actually think people come pre-wired to a set disposition or mindset, whether it's leaning more negative or positive. And I think I was just fortunate to have been born with a more positive natural mindset of, okay, what can I do about it versus the woe is me. I can't do anything. So it wasn't like I did anything special. I just got the right combination of genes that helped me be able to navigate that situation to a positive outcome.
I hear a lot of people say that when they have a naturally optimistic disposition, but I also hear that often is coupled with a rough upbringing or a poor background. Most of the people I know who are extremely optimistic, positive, it's a skill that they've cultivated over time of saying, "Okay, this may be a terrible situation, but look, I have one running water," or "I have a mom who loves me," or finding these little gratitude things of saying, "I like being able to wear 2 shoes that match to school every day," and really finding that. Is that something that you saw in your own life where you were cultivating that attitude of gratitude on purpose, or did it just come more naturally?
I don't think it was on purpose. Like I never thought about it that way. And now that you brought that up, I would say that definitely has to be like a defense mechanism or an adaptive mechanism that just triggers in people without you knowing about it. Like most trauma victims, they kind of zone out or go somewhere else when they're experiencing a certain trauma and they didn't do it on purpose. It just happened. So I'd say, yeah, because I was always the kid that whatever was happening, it wasn't too bad. Or we didn't really have money to eat. We would use change to go to get something off the dollar menu or something like that. My mom's crying sad about it. And I'm excited because I went to McDonald's anyway. So it didn't matter to me. But it wasn't an act of like, let me Jedi mind trick myself to feel like this is better than what it is. It just was. I didn't know to think about it negatively because it was my normal. Everybody around me was in the same position. So it wasn't like I knew to feel sorry for myself.
Did you have people around you who were not having that attitude, who were resentful and upset and they were feeling sorry for themselves? Or were you surrounded by a family and a group of people who felt more like, let's figure this out so we can end this cycle?
I think it was neither of those, but I was raised in a very Christian household. So most of my exposure to people outside of my nuclear family were at church. And there's just like this
Mhm.
level of delusion that is there because everything will be all right as long as you're faithful, strong and you believe. And so I can't say that I noticed the woe is me anyway, because all I ever saw was the prayer changes things, that things are gonna get better. And so yeah, that probably helped. There was just this delusion of it's all gonna be all right at some point if you go to church enough.
Yeah, my husband said something like that recently where he's just a really laid back guy. He has a pretty simple outlook on life. And I asked him, "What's your secret to happiness?" And he said, "A healthy dose of denial."
Yes, yes, I do think you just make it up in your head because what you think is what's going to be your actual reality. And why would you want to give yourself a bunch of negative thoughts to think about to produce a negative reality? So if it's that simple, then yes, I'm going to tell myself I'm a genius. I'm the greatest. Everything I want is going to happen. Like that's the reality I want for myself. So that's the delusion that I create for me.
I heard a quote recently, I think it was Emma Grede, she was on Jay Shetty's podcast, and she said that my mama taught me that I wasn't better than anybody else, but also no one was any better than me. And that balance of saying, I can do whatever extraordinary people can do because they're no better than me, at the same time saying I'm no better than anybody else was a fantastic succinct way to put what I've felt for a long time. I would see other people doing amazing things, and I'm like, "They're no smarter than me, better looking than me, better family than me, better genes than me." We're all kind of the same in a lot of ways, and seeing other people achieve and accomplish things really inspired me. Instead of saying, "Oh, well, they're better than me," or "They're smarter than me," or, "Oh, I shouldn't even try." I just have always felt like I'm not better than anybody else, but also nobody's any better than me either. And have you found that when you're coming through with this positive outlook and people who are very hopeful and teaching this and looking at your situation, instead of saying, "Oh, these people are better than me, they have more than me," versus being able to feel like, people who are successful, they're no different than I am.
Yeah, I don't but also I didn't have exposure to success until I went to college. I have a long runway of just, this is what's normal. I can remember calling home
Mhm.
my freshman year and being like, "Mom, I didn't know black people had money." Like, these kids are telling me that their parents and their grandparents, I'm first generation. She had a car when she was 16. There's something that I didn't know about until I was removed from the environment that I was in and exposed to people. So for the majority of it, it was just like lack of awareness. I didn't know that there was something I was missing outside of whatever I was watching on Nickelodeon, but that's TV, right? Not reality. So I think it was a lot of I didn't know. And then in the
Hmm.
place where I was exposed, it was with other people that looked like me. I went to an HBCU, which is a historically Black college and university. So the success that I saw for the first time mirrored me. There was never a moment where I had to look at somebody else, compare and say, well, this person's better for whatever reason. Because once I got exposed to success, it looked the same. It looked like somebody that could be a family member, a cousin, or aunt. So of course I could see it for myself too. So fortunately for me, I don't feel like I was ever in an environment that could give me that message of someone could be better than you or we're not the same. So I
Hmm.
definitely think that contributed to that.
Yeah, and in my upbringing, because we're raised kind of middle class, suburban neighborhood, the people who were more successful than us, because my parents, they're like me, they're kind of smart about where they would buy their real estate, where they wanted to be the poorest people in the neighborhood or the smallest house in a nice neighborhood. So they're always trying to be at the bottom end of who they were associating with and where they were buying their houses. So we're surrounded by people who were more successful than us, who looked just like us, who had similar backgrounds to us, who had similar education and even jobs to us. Why were they more successful? And so I think that that bred at the same time of they're just like us, we can do what they're doing. Also, that sense of frustration, like, I don't actually know how they did it because they're not any different than us. And I don't exactly know what to do. And so there was a little bit of a confusion. So when you first started hanging around with people who were financially in a position that you felt like, I can do what they're doing, they're just like me, I can do it. Was there a period of time where you're like, "Okay, I know it's possible, but I have no idea how?"
Well, we met in the same place, right? So I know that your family had a different experience than mine, but where you and I are, we're meeting at the same place. We're both at the beginning of building our own lives. So there was never that they're doing something that I don't know how to do yet. We started at the same place. That was just my first realization that my family or upbringing or the environment I came from was not the same everywhere, that it was a little
Mhm.
different. So I had missed the part where I was supposed to compare myself to other people because I didn't know those other people to do that comparison. So I'll say that was a lucky hit. I don't want to say that like being surrounded by poverty and is lucky, but yeah, that was its perk for me. This
Yeah, that ability to find a silver lining in something, I think is what really marks you, is that you're able to look at a situation without comparison, and then but looking back on it, now that you do have something to compare it to, looking back on it, you're able to still find the positive parts of it. I hear a lot of people who are raised in more of that, like, middle class, suburban type of thing, talking about how good is the enemy of great. Things are good enough. You stick your neck out there, you might lose what you have. It's like people who are living in their car and really struggling are like, "Ah, if this doesn't work out, I know how to do that." But people who have a comfortable life tend to let good be the enemy of great, and it almost creates a more pessimistic outlook on life even though they had a better upbringing. It's like this strange, ironic twist that they don't really appreciate what could be because they're so scared and stingy about what they already have. That's definitely been a factor in my life is becoming more positive and putting my neck out and taking those risks because we did have something to it was in some ways harder. So I guess just take me to when you finished college, you're got your business degree, you're working in the industry, you have this mindset of the history where you're saving money and you're doing the right things, you're learning about business. What did those first couple of years between when you graduated high school and when you did your first real estate deal? Take me through that period.
So the first real estate deal, I was actually 19 and I didn't know
Nice.
anything about what I was doing, right? I just had this idea that I shouldn't throw money away behind rent. And if I bought something, I could invest. I didn't know anything about other people's money, but I used that in this deal. I talked to my sister and convinced her to take the loan out for me. I had savings. I said I would fix up the property, but if she could just take the loan, I'd make sure it's paid every month. I was house hacking and didn't know it because in order to be able to pay it every month, I had a roommate in there with me as well. So that whole situation, it was with no understanding or awareness of what real estate that was. It was just a simple, I think it's better to own it and not rent it. So convincing whoever I could to help me pull that off. But that eventually foreclosed. And even still, like that entire time I owned that, I never viewed myself as an investor or something to continue on down the line. It was just this one thing that I did. And I went off from college, took my corporate job. I thought I would only have to do for 2 years, right? I wanted to make sure my student loans were paid off. And I had done the numbers and said I could get this paid off at if I take this job with the salary within 2 years, and then maybe I can chase a dream or pursue some other interest because I knew corporate wasn't what I wanted, but I didn't know what I wanted. But I knew that
Mhm.
not having debt would allow me the opportunity to be able to explore or figure that out. So my first 2 years out of college, I spent putting my entire salary against my student loans until those were paid off.
Yeah, I feel like in my church growing up really talked about living a debt-free lifestyle and being self-sufficient, and that was a huge impact on my life from a very early age. Did you have that similar background that if you didn't have debt, then you could pursue a dream? I've never heard anybody phrase it quite like that before.
No, it was because I grew up in debt. I watched my parents live paycheck to paycheck and go through bankruptcy. So I was basically
Mhm,
doing the opposite of whatever I had saw. I knew this wasn't good, and that was enough to know not to do it. But I was in, I didn't have the positive messages. These are the right things to do. All I
mhm,
had was examples of these are the things you should not do if you want a different
mhm.
life than what you're in right now. And so that was my goal, just to do the opposite. So I grew up in a debt household and experienced bankruptcy. So as an adult, I didn't want any parts of debt.
Now, somebody said something to me recently. What you just said, I wanna unpack a little bit of that. It was somebody who was making a great income in the tech industry and saying they didn't know anything about investing in real estate. So they had been investing in tech startups because that was what they knew, what they understood, but the tech startups were, they can be risky and it can take a while to return. And he was saying, "I feel like I need to invest in real estate, but I don't know how." But then he was like, "But I grew up in a house. I live in a house. I work in a commercial building. I understand real estate at a fundamentally basic level in a way that I never understood tech startups before I started working in the tech industry." And so being able to take this situation where you bought your first house and you didn't know you were house hacking and you didn't really know any of that you were a real estate investor, apartment dwellers understand roommates. A lot of apartment dwellers get a roommate to help pay the rent. And so you just took that one step further to say like, I get this well enough to be able to say owning is better than renting and I'm going to get a roommate so that I can pay for this kind of stuff. And so coming from that like basic intrinsic thing that real estate is so central to all of our lives. We all spend most of our time inside buildings, whether it's at home or at work. Do you think that that kind of basic understanding of how the world works with houses was something that allowed you at 19 to go buy your first house? Because that's very unusual.
I think so. I think also I can remember there being a pride in my family because we owned the house that we lived in. And we had never lived in any other house. So having not, I think that was a sense of pride or things that were spoke to growing up. We owned our house and I lived in the same house my whole life. And so did my siblings. So I knew that was a source of pride for my parents. And that was
Mhm.
probably like a latent thing that just hung out in my subconscious so that when I was living in college housing and we're three roommates paying towards something, and I'm like, hey, I could do the same thing. And I had the subconscious thing telling me that owning is better than renting. So that's probably why
Mhm.
that came to the forefront.
So the first time that you decided, "I'm gonna buy a house," because when I bought my first house, we were living in an apartment, I was married, and we just had our first little baby, and both of our parents were homeowners. Like I said, we were raised in kinda suburbia type of thing. So I did know that I wanted to buy a house, but I didn't know when, and I figured we'd live in an apartment for a few years. We didn't make very much money, and we didn't really know that much about money. But a realtor came and stuck a little sign on my door with something about how we could qualify for some down payment assistance programs in our county or something like that. And so I called him and it worked out. We bought our first house. And I look back on that and it was very soon after we got married, much sooner than I was thinking that we would be able to buy a house. And I have such gratitude that this realtor went and put this brochure on my door because I never would have known about any of this kind of stuff. So, what was it in your life that was like, I'm gonna go buy my first house? Was it just this idea that came in and then you're like, I should call a mortgage lender? What did that process actually look like?
It was an idea that came in, and so I would drive around. Like, I always liked looking at houses. Even when I was a kid, I would get my mom would look at the newspaper, and I'd sit to the next to her, and she'd look at something and pass it over to me. But I would pull the real estate section too, and I loved looking at floor plans. And I kept a little shoebox with these floor plans, like my favorite word.
Oh,
No
oh my,
connections.
I did.
Yeah, like, don't know why. I just liked it. So fast forward 18 years later, long forgot about that shoebox, but I still liked looking at houses. So when I came up with this idea, it was like, let me just ride around. And I would look at things that were for sale and call the owner about them. Had no idea how you got money to buy a house or what to do. I just knew that this was a good idea and that my sister, who went to college before me, she now has a job. So once I found a house or was looking at things, I called her and was like, hey, I think this is a good idea. We should do this. That's meant for you. I'll take care of it. But the other half of that was something she dealt with in terms of getting the linden. Like, I had no exposure to that. I didn't even know what I was asking her to do for sure. Like, I had no idea what that would entail, down payment, credit impact, nothing. It was just an idea that I pursued. And luckily, I was able to convince my sister to go down that rabbit hole with.
Well, let's unpack what you said before, where that property eventually foreclosed and that you were able to not take that as I'm a failure. This was a dumb idea. This was dangerous. I shouldn't have messed with it. How to come back out of that result and say, okay, maybe I did that wrong, but that doesn't mean I'm on the wrong path.
It had the opposite effect, actually. It wasn't like I didn't feel like I was a failure after. It was like a mask lifted because by the time that
Mm.
foreclosed, let's say I had been working in corporate for 6 years, 5 years at that point. And each year that went on, I remember I was only supposed to be there for 2. I paid off those
Yeah.
student loans. I wasn't still supposed to be there. So each year that passed, everything about, I guess, who I thought I was, that scrappy person with crazy ideas like, let's buy a house at 19. I was always an outside the box thinker. And each year I spent in corporate, I was less and less of that. And so now my thoughts were, what's the next new idea or what business could I start? It was, okay, where's the next relocation going to be? What next position do I want? Climbing that
Mhm.
ladder. And having to foreclose on that house and give those keys back, it was like a veil lifted, like, wait a minute, what have I been doing? Like, this is who I was. I bought this at 18. I did those renovations. I painted these walls, and I had forgotten all about that. So it was more like a trigger to remind me of, okay, this is who you were and the types of things you should be doing, not just on somebody's job waiting on them to give you the next opportunity. You're supposed to be creating your opportunity. So it was more of a wake up call for me than a failure. And I guess that ties into the being able to look at things more positively than negatively because it completely missed me to feel like I had failed. All I could think of was, I need to try to do this again because I can do better than what I'm doing right now.
It's sad that humans learn better from failures than we do from successes, because I had a similar thing where after I started investing in real estate, I knew what it was. I was in the clubs, I was going to the meetups, I was doing the thing, and we put a contract on a large apartment building, and we weren't able to get it across the finish line, and we pulled out of the contract, and I lost a lot of money. And that experience of, like you said, that weight being lifted off my shoulders, it was backwards. I really felt like I should be more upset about it than I actually was, but I was really relieved. And so I had to go inside my head and spend some time with myself and figure out why I didn't want this apartment building and why I was relieved that we lost it. And out of that came the next phase of my investing journey where I remembered where I came from. I remember like I got into this for passive income because we were in our 40s when we started. And it was never to start and run a huge business. It was always to amass passive cash flow so that we could retire early. Because we were at that point in our 40s where you're starting to think, like, how much longer am I going to do this or live like this? Sometimes those failures are better teachers than the successes. And so you were able to take that as a positive thing. So where did you go from there? Take us from that point to the present day and catch us up on the things that you've been working on. And then we can talk about the types of things that you're working on now with those lessons behind you.
So I foreclosed on that in early 2014, and by the end of 2014, I had started shopping for another property to buy in Orlando where I
Mhm.
live. So again, that was like, wake up call. What are you doing? You knew what you should have been doing, or you've just been squandering it. So I started looking for another property, and it took us about 9 months to find one. So I didn't find something until 2015. And at that point, it wasn't, I'm going to be a real estate investor. It was, it's better to own and not rent. So I'm going to buy
Mhm.
something, live in it. And then now that I know a little bit more about money management, I have listened to Howard and Susie Orman, and just I was really good with money and very financially responsible. It was more so, how do I make the best financial decision for myself? And that was to own versus rent, and then also to buy for the lowest price that I could so that I could pay it off as quickly as possible. Because again, I'm still in the,
Mhm.
I want to avoid debt phase. So I found something, bought it at the end of 2010 with a 15-year mortgage because I'm paying it off in 5. And that was
Yep.
the goal for that first house, to just have a paid off home so that I didn't have to work anymore, or work be optional, and I could have more flexibility in terms of what I did for a career, because I wasn't very happy in the career path I was on.
So that would you say that was 2015?
Mhm.
Okay, and what are you doing right now? Because this is the thing that really got me when I first met you. Because you were with another friend who already knew you, and I asked you, what you were up to, 'cause just introducing ourselves, and she made a comment about how you're just chilling or living on passive income or she didn't use the words retire early, but she basically made it clear that you don't have to work anymore. And, me as a married person with 6 kids, like, my threshold of what I have to be making to be work optional is so intimidatingly high. Like, someone so much younger than me who's already doing it, I immediately was like, "Wait, what? Tell me more about this." So paint me what that looks like, where you got your second house, you kinda got back on your feet to the point now where you're like, "I'm just kind of figuring stuff out because I don't have to work anymore." What did that transition look like?
It looked like making smart money management decisions. So I bought a house, cheap house, fixed it up myself. I was going to get roommates again because, again, house hacking, didn't know it was called house hacking, but I knew the less I had to spend on expenses, the better off my budgeting and savings would be. But rather than doing a roommate, I ended up doing Airbnb. And that was
Mhm.
just like an explosion within the first month, lighter fluid. Like, holy crap, my entire mortgage is paid and I'm cash flowing 1,500 on top of that. Let me pay attention to this. So I spent a full year and a half solely focused on just running the Airbnb business. And in doing that, when people would meet me and find out about it, they were classifying me as a real estate investor. And I was like, pause. I'm just like, I'm doing smart things with my money. I've eliminated my
Yeah.
expenses and I'm paying down my debt. But it was having another real estate investor in my neighborhood look at me that way and introduce me as a budding investor, that I was like, oh, I should go figure out what being a real estate investor is. If this is what
Yeah.
people think I am now. So let me go figure that part out. So then I spent the rest of that year just like all in my bigger pockets, all day, every podcast I could listen to, in the forums, Googling things on websites. I joined my local RIA. I basically went into full education mode. So by the time we got to the end of 2019 and there was an opportunity to buy a home in my childhood neighborhood, I
Mhm.
understood what that process would be. I understood that it was an off market opportunity and how I needed to pursue it. And I went after it and I got that. So that was the first investment property purchase now that I'm thinking about building a real estate investment portfolio. Everything before that was just, I'm smart with money and making good financial decisions. So 2019 November was the first investment property purchase. And then 2020, I bought a new primary. So then there were three. And then 21 bought another one. And that was it. Those four, really the first property alone was enough to cover all of my living expenses. So each additional purchase over that was just lifestyle enhanced. But I'm also single with
Mm,
no kids.
yeah, I think we were similar to what you're saying, like inadvertent investors, like the Robert Kiyosaki's, like your primary home is not an asset. It doesn't cash flow. It's a liability. And I still, in some ways, disagree with that a little bit because we were inadvertently investing. Not all investments have to cash flow. In fact, that's one thing we're struggling with right now is a lot of things we've invested in flowing. And so that makes things kind of weird when you're retired on your passive income is like not knowing the next time you're going to get paid. And so I feel like we had inadvertently bought some houses like that very first one with down payment assistance, made some money, and then 2008 didn't make any money. Bought another couple houses, renovated them. And so we were just living, like you said, making smart money decisions and knowing that owning was better than renting and adding value by fixing it up, making it look nice, and knowing I don't know where I got this from. Knowing I told my husband, I said, "We need to move occasionally. It's just like changing jobs and getting a raise." I said, "We need to move occasionally so that we can make some money off of the house and buy one that is in distress, like sell it at the top and buy at the bottom." I don't know where I got that from. Sometimes it's just little drips of drops of things. So that same kind of thing where we didn't do it on purpose, but when we finally got into, as you call, full education mode, suddenly it was like there's this rabbit hole, and I realized what we were doing kinda naturally, if we honed that, could become something really, really powerful. And so, again, it takes us longer to become work optional because our expenses are so high, and our needs to have a good lifestyle is also high because our kids are getting older, they're moving out. We wanna transition our relationship with our adult kids to having more fun instead of being like, "Are you on time?" Or like, now we have to be fun because our kids are adult. And that can be expensive. And so we had some pretty high goals there. But tell us about like what our day job looks like now. Tell me about your day job. Our day job is running our real estate investing business and also having passive income from some of our rentals. So the combination of those two things is really what is getting us through. So we probably have maybe 80% of our income coming from passive sources and the rest coming from active entrepreneurial sources. So what does your day job look like now?
My day job now is of left field sometimes. So it's real estate adjacent, but not quite real estate anymore. So I own and operate a 24-hour nursing facility for individuals with developmental disabilities. Where's the real estate in that, right? Well, we have to
Yeah.
do that within a building. And you can
Mhm.
get a change of use on a residential property to operate this business model in. And we were perfectly happy with Airbnb, and it changed our lives. I didn't have to retire. My 2020, my partner came on and started working full time in the business with me. But as regulations continue to change and there's chatter about Airbnb and cities are pushing
Mhm.
back and adding all of these requirements, I knew that it wasn't going to last forever, especially not in the area where we were because it wasn't as Airbnb or short term only. So I was looking for something that I could convert to, but still use my property. And once you do short term, you can't go back to long term. So this assisted living model became of interest, and that's how we ended up here.
That's very smart that you're reading the writing on the wall because people I know who say have successful YouTube channels, content creation, and they feel like they can't put all their eggs in, say, the YouTube basket or the TikTok basket. They know that this could all go away tomorrow, and they always need to keep their ear to the ground, thinking like, what are the threats? Like the opportunity threat analysis. What are the threats? And so you're looking for that. I mean, we all did the SWOT in business school,
Mhm.
right? So being able to look at that instead of saying, "Oh, I'm gonna ride this, Airbnb wave forever," keeping your ear to the ground and thinking, "All right, I'm gonna ride it as long as it lasts, but I'm gonna use this time of success to queue up the next thing and stay in front of those kinds of curves." So what was it about residential assisted living? Where did you find out about that? And what was it? Because 'Cause we've looked into it ourselves, and it didn't really go along with our passive income goals. It was too management intensive, and so we tried to just rent our house out to an operator, and it just keeps not working out for us, and so we finally just got to the point where we're like, "Ah, we're not gonna do it." So, where did that come from for you, and how were you able to make that a reality?
I had a friend that was a contractor, and he had a family member that was operating these types of homes, and he would do it for the home. So I learned about it from him, and he and his wife were considering it as well. But it was the only thing when you look at all the different rental models, it was the only thing where the estimates would beat the performance we had with short-term rental. And we needed short-term rental to perform the way it does because that's what we were living off of fully. I was no longer at my job. So it needed to beat short-term, and that's really hard to do, but this model did. I decided to build it though as a business to work on it and not in it. So immediately from hiring to start, I hired administration, I hired nurses, I had hired who was going to be. So the
Mhm.
plan for now is I'm involved and I'm doing the full operations for this first year or two. But as I do it, my admin is already in place who's going to take over what I'm doing and they're learning it as I'm learning it at the same time. So I actually, within this first year of operation, I've had complete freedom. Like I have nothing to do with the day-to-day operations of it. I'm not here. It's such a skilled role. Nurses and CNAs have to do it. I don't have a medical background. There was no need for me. So I had to
Mm.
staff in order for it to operate on its own. And I'm training my backfield as we go along. And right now, she can run this house fully on her own. I pop in and pop out as needed, but most of what I do, I can do on my laptop wherever I am in whatever country. So I built it to operate with it's almost like
Mhm.
building to sell or building to walk away from. Like I built it so that it didn't need me. So it still feels very much somewhat passive. Like it doesn't require me. I think that helped. If I didn't have her as my admin to run the day to day, it would be a lot harder. But also because it's nursing, prevented me from being able to do it. I think if we didn't have nursing, I probably would have tried to do some shifts myself and do some of the work myself, but I couldn't because I just didn't have that skill set. So it forced you to have to build it to operate without me.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it because most people are like, "I'm an attorney, I'm gonna start a law business," and they're really the what do they say? The chief cook and bottle washer. They're working in the business because they do the business in their area of expertise. I've heard somebody say something similar where she bought all of her rentals out of state to force her to learn to rely on property management, and not in the sense of, "I'm just gonna hire a property manager and they'll take care of it." But she was focusing her business on learning to manage managers rather than manage properties, and I had never heard anybody else say that because people say, "Oh, out-of-state investing is a bad idea. You need to be close. You need to be because you don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you don't know." But for her, she started out of state and became a managing manager. So was that a similar type of thing where because she did it on purpose, but it sounds like you might have done it a little bit more inadvertently where you're like, "I don't know anything about nursing, so I cannot work in this business." That's not why you chose that business though, but it was it just
Right.
a unintended
I chose it for the numbers. So the math is what
Mhm,
got me here because yeah, I had a set goal. I needed to beat short-term rental. So the numbers are what got me here. But when you backtrack into, okay, how do I actually pull this off to get to that number? It had to be nursing. That's not my skill set. So I had to go recruit and make sure I brought in people who could do that. So it was inadvertent, but the best thing ever. Because if I was in here trying to change diapers and do all this other stuff, I couldn't also then be doing the marketing and advertising to get people in here and focusing on growing a business. So I'm glad I can't do it. It does make you feel useless, like a lot. And if you struggle with that, especially if you come from being fully in the business and the whole business is you and you're running everything, to not be able to do anything requires a much higher level of vulnerability, a much higher level of trust of the people that you're working with and a lot of self-talk to remind yourself that you're still valuable even though you can't do anything.
Oh, that vulnerability, that rings true because the more high level I go in my own business, dumber I feel. I've never thought about that as requiring humility and vulnerability. I feel like we spend a lot of time trying to compensate or even cover up the fact of how useless we actually are in a lot of aspects of our own business. How are you finding value in that? Because a lot of people, they hear like, "Oh, hands-off business," because people hear passive income and they think that they don't have to have any money to do it, that they're just going to go start some sort of hands-off business. people who have money know that you put it in, you're a limited partner, you don't do literally anything. You don't have voting. You're just like buying a stock where you're completely hands off. That's true passive income is where you put money in and money comes back. Whereas, most people, when they think about passive income, are thinking more in terms of a hands-off business, especially one that doesn't take a lot of money to start. I think that's where a lot of the passive income scams come from. You're gonna have passive business income source, and there's no business that's really passive, right? And it's low startup costs. It's a unicorn that and so how are you having that self-talk? Say, "Okay, I have a hands-off business. I feel kinda useless," but at the same time, we know that totally hands-off business is a myth. So there must be things that you are contributing and doing that are creating that value while you're still there getting paid.
It's semi-passive, right? It's not fully passive because when you are fully passive, you also give up some of the control because you're handing your money over to someone else and trusting them to do what they want with it and hoping that it comes back. I don't know that I'll ever get to the point where that's comfortable. So semi-passive is my nice middle of the road where I did a lot of the work up front. From that passive income, well, semi-passive income from Airbnb, I funded this business. So we had a year's worth
Mm,
of savings in there so that I could build it and staff and pay that staff without having to fill in the gaps and try to work some things myself. So having that savings and that business plan up front, I think was the best because most people are starting with much lower access to cash. And so they have to either do some of the work themselves or grow a lot slower versus having had a 2 year work plan and save money to be able to fund the first year operations with full staff, even if we didn't have clientele yet. So I think taking that approach helps and letting it be semi-passive, right? So I can do some things. I can do a lot of administrative things. I can do all of the HR things and not have to pay for that. So that's my skin of the game. But then the things that I do have to pay for, I do that nursing operation. I have the funds saved up to be able to do that. But I think that middle of the road, it also still gives me the control that I would want over the business versus trusting someone else with my money. I'm able to still maintain 100% ownership or control of it if I do a little bit. So I'm perfectly okay doing 5 to 10 hours worth of work a week. It was the 40 hours worth of work a week I didn't want. All right. So, but 5 to 10 was just fine.
there are a couple of things I wanna get really into some nitty-gritty here with nuts and bolts, but I also wanna talk a little bit more about the emotional side of things. Remind me to come back to this question later. I wanna talk about trust because you mentioned trusting your staff, but you also mentioned trusting other people with your money, and that's something that we've been grappling with ourselves, is that control, lack of control, and because I think because 'cause we're older, we have to start thinking about what does actual retirement look like? Like literally all of your income is passive income where you are putting your money in and most people find that through the stock market, either 401k or something they're living off of that. So we're asking ourselves the same question like how much of our income do we want to go in as a 100% limited partner so that we can be truly truly retired, not just running a real estate business where we're fairly hands off or it's part-time because for the next several years we definitely want to work part-time but eventually we need to get to the point where like we are truly retired on 100% passive income. What does that look like and learning how to trust? But I also want to talk about the math, how you said you got there by the numbers, how you learned how to run those numbers, how you run those numbers, whose responsibility is that? So take us first in let's start with the math part of it. Like where did you learn how to run those numbers? Because when we're running numbers on our assisted living place, I didn't even have a template or a spreadsheet. I was just like, I had no idea. How do you know the numbers beat short-term rental? Where did you find that information? And how did you learn how to do that?
Let's use that run the numbers term very loosely.
Okay.
I am not a math person by any means. So my number run is going to be very simple. There's not even a real formula. This is what I make on Airbnb. Here are the estimates that I'm hearing per patient. And you can have up to 5 in the house. The total of that is that higher or lower than our Airbnb? It was higher. Okay, cool. That was it. That was
Yeah.
the extent. It was a very loose number run. Oh, and actually, once we started operating, the numbers were way off in the positive, but still way off. So there wasn't anything, honestly, but hearsay. It's not like I ever saw someone's actual check or statement come in per month for what they were earning. It was just hearsay, kind of roundabout.
Mm.
I maybe I'm a little risky, but it was more like a what's the worst that could happen? I own this property. They can't take it from me. I can try it. And if it doesn't work, I know I can do one of 4 or 5 other rental models.
Mhm.
So it was more like these roundabout numbers of hearsay sound good enough for me to explore to see what it is. There was no factual, this is exact.
Mhm.
It was more so like I think you can find on my agency's website their rate tables for certain services. So, like residential rehabilitation, like that individual living in your home, you could see what their standard, moderate, or extensive rates are
Mhm.
and use those as hard numbers. And that was enough to beat Airbnb. It doesn't tell the full story, but those numbers were at least higher than what I would bring in with a short term rental and it would cover the mortgage. So it was enough to figure it out
Mhm.
versus how do I concrete these are that's absolutely going to happen. It was I have a ton. I don't need to make money right away because my rentals, passive income in other areas are what I'm actually living out of. So I could just go explore and see what would happen if.
One of the things that really got me about assisted living was how much higher the expenses are because on an apartment building, we're projecting somewhere between 40 on the very low end to 60 on the higher end in like high insurance states, high disaster states, high property tax states. So somewhere between 40 to 60%. So we just do a rule of thumb at 50%. But assisted living, my rule of thumb was 70 to 75% expense ratio. And so even though we were be making a lot more, with the income, the expenses were so high that I almost felt like the numbers for me were killing the deal because I felt like my margin was shrinking. And so, how do you handle things on the expense side? Because you said that your numbers were off, but in your favor, they're better than what you were expecting. How did the expenses factor into that early on? And how are you finding that expense ratio now that you're actually in it and running it?
Okay. And again, I don't even calculate ratios. Like I'm not doing numbers in a sophisticated way. But I will say that within the assisted living, under that umbrella, there's so many different patient populations or agencies that you can serve. And the type that you are serving will dictate what you're earning. So the facility you looked at may have had a client population that were not in the earnings bracket of where I am. So I'm doing assisted living, but also on top of that, I'm providing 24 nursing care.
Mhm.
And that's 2 different pay buckets. I think assisted living alone out of a facility is too high. But when you can do it in a residential property, those numbers are much more feasible. But when you pair that with nursing services, you have 2 different buckets that you're getting paid from. My expenses are very high. My payroll expense for a year alone is like $239,000. But if I can handle payroll expense, 2 patients cover
Mhm.
that payroll expense. There are 3 more patients in a home. So the expenses are higher, but the earnings are worth it for this niche
Mhm.
that I'm in. I don't know that that will be true if I was doing senior care or sober living.
Mhm.
It's true for 24-hour nursing services for developmental disabilities.
Mhm. Okay, yeah, that's a good point because we did look at some other categories of how sober living would compare to disability living versus senior living, and they were all at different price points, but they all had different expenses as well because some needed more nursing than others. And so sometimes I feel like if I know too much about the numbers, it can kill the deal. But if I don't know enough about it, I feel like I'm getting emotionally attached and flying by the seat of my pants. And so I feel like it's that 80-20 rule. You know, 80% of it, and you're willing to to take the other 20% and recognize diminishing returns. You and I sound like we actually have a fairly similar risk profile at a certain point. Like you said about business school, the only way you're going to learn it is by going and starting a business and then having that feeling of I have these other sources of income to cushion that while I go out here and learn. It doesn't have to be as hard a lesson. So I'm not a burn the boats kind of person either. I'm more of a let's create a lot of backup plans, have a lot of exit plans. Let's go out and test the waters here because no matter how good your pro forma is, it's never going to be right. And so I think people get a false sense of security in the numbers when they are doing the minutia of a spreadsheet. They either get too scared, right? Like sometimes that happens to me, or they feel like the spreadsheet says this and this is how it's gonna be. And you and I know better. That's That's not how it is. That's not what decides what the business is actually gonna look like.
I don't make any spreadsheets. I am a fly by the seat of my pants, but a non-emotional by the seat of my pants. It's more like if it went wrong, what would I do?
Mm,
And if I can solve for that, I'm going to do it. And
mhm.
so, in general, when it comes to real estate investing, if it went wrong and I lost everything, my mom has an extra room in her house and she'll let me live there. So, that is enough to try or take whatever risk. If it went wrong with this, I could just continue doing what I was doing, short or go to long term or midterm or whatever other rental model. If it went wrong, I could sell it. So that's usually enough. Like I'm not penciling, I'm not putting a spreadsheet out. It's going to be a rough calculation of is there a gap between my expenses and what I'll earn? Yes. Okay. I'm going to go find out what that gap is. But I know if it doesn't work out, I have plan A, B, C, D that I could switch over to. I don't know, it might be risky to risk some, but for me, it was just like, what's the worst that could happen? I have to live back in with my mom, and that's okay.
Yeah, that's almost like full circle what we were talking about at the beginning. It's like the good is the enemy of great. And sometimes if you've been living in your car and I use that example because the founder of Burt's Bees was one of the case studies that we did in business school. I think she was living in her car with twins. And she would say, if this Burt's Bees thing doesn't work out, I can always go move back into my car. I know how to do that. And that was very impactful for me as a suburban kid because I'd never heard anybody say anything like that before. And this was the second time I went to college. I was probably 37 before I heard anybody say that. Like, wait a second. If you know how to live in your car, then you can take bigger risks because it doesn't seem as scary. And so I think maybe that's part of the superpower that we're having right now is slashing our expenses down. We live full time in an RV and we have really slashed our expenses. And it's almost giving me this sense of empowerment. Like I can do anything. And I
Mhm.
can take I can take bigger risks because I know how to I know how to be frugal. I know how to do this. And it's empowering from that standpoint rather than
Exactly.
scary.
Yep.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, when you have no debt, right? Like I have no debt. I have no expenses, essentially, because I've whittled all that stuff down. And I've had to pack up all my stuff and move home before. So there wasn't, to me, there wasn't really anything to fear. One, because I was very financially responsible and I knew that with small amounts of money, I could make do.
Mhm.
But also, I could I didn't have to live in the apartment when I was living or in the house I was living in. I could change things. So I didn't feel like anything was so static that it couldn't change if it had to. So yeah,
Yeah. That's been a powerful thing for me in my later adult life. It sounds like you figured it out a lot younger than I did.
well, because I came from instability, so it's comfortable over here for me. Like I don't need it to all be nice or have the plan laid out. That would probably be more uncomfortable for me than existing in riskiness or instability.
Yeah. I'm a high novelty seeker, but it's more like I like to travel and meet new people novelty. It's not so much novelty seeker. I do like stability and I do like security and certainty, but then I like the novelty should be fun. That's the fun part, right?
Yeah,
But that's
Yeah, and once you have given yourself a certain level of stability and security, like I'm debt free and my expenses are paid, that's all the stability and security you need. Now you should just go crazy
Mhm,
on the other end of that because you've already done the hard work and set that foundation for you to be able to like springboard and explore to other things.
mhm, yes. Good advice, and I think that it reinforces to me that sometimes we can come from different backgrounds and different origin everybody has a different origin story, so to speak. Sometimes we end up making the same conclusions at the end of it, coming to the same place. Tell me, what does your bookkeeping look like now from a business management standpoint? You said you have people who are doing the nursing and you're doing some of the marketing and the admin. How are you doing the financial management? Because I think this is where a lot of business owners fall down in their inability to really get their hands around a P&L to be able to say, "This is my profit, my loss on a annual, quarterly, monthly basis."
QuickBooks and a CPA. So I set up QuickBooks for this. I do everything out of one business account and one business credit card for this business, and all of that is synced to QuickBooks. So every transaction that happens here is going recorded somewhere. So at the end of the year, I can give my CPA access to that QuickBooks account or print out whatever report he's looking for and send it to him, and he can do his taxes from there.
Mhm.
That's it.
Okay. And that's similar to what I'm doing in my business. Who does your QuickBooks categorization? Like when a transaction comes in and you have to assign it to a category, how often do you get in there and do those book updates?
I've been in there once this year.
Okay.
So I set it up and then I've gone back in there last week actually to clean up categorizations. It's mostly the same transaction. So there weren't a lot of different rules that I had to set up. There's
Mhm.
payroll coming out, there's money coming in, and then there are Amazon orders. So it's rather simple what we have to spend money on or where the money comes from. So there weren't a lot of like different rules and categories to create.
And I find that my bookkeeping, it gets away from me because it's a lot of irregular, non-recurring expenses, and I have to get in there once a week, at least once a month. If I wait longer than that, I start to forget because 'cause I'm like, "What did I buy on Amazon and why? Was this a business expense, and which house did it go to?" Because I got multiple properties. So you have a different
Uh,
'cause I'm running all my rental houses through the same QuickBooks account, and then all my commercial properties all have their own, but my little residentials are combined. Is that really the difference for
yeah.
you have your own thing for one business?
So for that business, for the rental property business, that's a separate business with separate QuickBooks. But to keep everything easy, each house has its own credit card.
Mm,
So when it comes into QuickBooks, it automatically knows, oh, if it came on this card, it's this house. That's the short term rental or that's the long term rental. And so it's easier to classify that way. I think in that business, if I was using like one credit card for all of those things, then I would have a lot more work. But that first layer of categorization is taken care of. Each house has its own card. So I already know this is for XYZ.
Do you pay your utilities on the credit card as well? Because a lot of our bills are coming out.
I pay everything on the credit card.
Okay,
Yeah, so I try to pay everything on the credit card because when it comes through on that credit card statement, it already has a certain level of description or categorization. I try not to pay anything directly from the account, but the credit card statement.
and how about the rent?
So, and that makes it easier.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. See, this is what I like about this podcast because I feel like one of my missions is to help business people get great business information, like the tips that you're sharing, so that they can go make more money in their business, so they have more money to invest, so they have more money to enjoy. And for me, it's not just about passive income. It's sometimes it's like, okay, if you make more money in your area of expertise, then you can invest more money outside your area of expertise. And that's really how we can come back to the trust issue there. That's really how I've kind of gotten around it. So great tips there. So one more question. How do you handle the rents coming in if they're not being coming in on the credit card if you have mixed more than one property on the same QuickBooks or on the same bank account?
So they all come in, but I don't have a large portfolio. So a part of my strategy as well was to keep it very small. I
Mhm.
have 5 properties. I'm hard pressed. I don't think I'm going to exceed that. And it's all short term rental income. So I don't have to classify that by property. Short term is treated the same way, regardless of where the property is. They're all in Florida, so that's easy. The only property that I have to put a different rule for is the one that's long term because that income comes through or needs to be classified differently.
Mhm.
So that was just one adjustment I had to make. I think maybe it would be harder if it was all long-term rentals. I have to do a little something different. But all of that is coming in digitally. It'll come directly into the bank account from whatever platform we're on or Stripe. But then I'm only setting up a rule for anything that comes in from Airbnb, be Stripe. So that's still just 3 rules I want to set up. And once you set it one time, it's all automatically categorizing those things.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah. And one of the things I have to do is I sold a rental house recently and I didn't have a way to separate out the expenses for that particular property because it was a triplex. So it was being sold as a commercial property and they needed to have clean books of expenses that were only attributed to that property. And so being able to say, okay, I got rental income from this address. I have subcategories for each. So rent income has a subcategory for each address. So I wasn't able to just pull a report on that property. Say, I just want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Main Street and show me everything. No, I had to go pull out the rent and I had to pull out the utilities. I had to pull out everything in subcategorization. And it was a huge pain. And so I feel like my bookkeeping while I'm doing it is probably not as efficient as it should be. So I'm always talking to people about getting more efficient business systems and saving time because a hands-off business should be hands-off. So it sounds like you've got some pretty good systems there so that you can keep things, like you said, that 5 to 10 hour a week period and setting up some automations and some rules to simplify so you can work on the business, the important parts, and not get bogged down in a lot of those admin details. So you're doing it, but you're doing it smart. So it's simpler.
And I do have a CPA, right? So it's his job to figure out how to pull those reports out of QuickBooks. For the rental portfolio, he set that up initially. So he set up the initial categorizations. And after learning that with him, because sometimes I still would have to go in there, categorize something that he may not have known, that's how I was able to set up this business myself in my own QuickBooks.
Yeah, I did. I hired my CPA's bookkeeper. I think I paid her like $1,000 and we had 4 or 5 meetings where she came and she literally taught me how to use QuickBooks and trained me through. We set up everything category. You get out of business school, they don't talk about bookkeeping at all.
Yeah.
My kids went to a trade school and they had a bookkeeping class of like QuickBooks bookkeeping. And I was looking at that like, why did I have that class? And it was entrepreneurial management and we had accounting 101 and 102, but 0 bookkeeping, and so I got out of business school, I had been running businesses for years at that point, and I got out of business school and went, "I know nothing more now about doing my books than I did before I went to business school." And so at that point was when I realized I'm gonna have to go create my own education here and found somebody who was good at doing it and basically paid her that annual fee to sit with me for basically a year to do my book so that I was okay with doing it. And I really wanted to do that because I felt like when I do get to the point where I was ready to hire a bookkeeper, I wanted to know the bookkeeper was doing a good job. And we had a system in place that I could understand and keep an eye on. So doing some of the things yourself, yes, it's not hands off, but at the same time, you're better able to trust that the people you're bringing in are doing a good job because you know how it should be, keeping an eye on it. So,
Right.
has doing it yourself helped impact your level of trust? Because let's say nursing, you don't know anything about medical stuff. How do you trust that when they are doing something you know nothing about, that they're doing a good job?
That trust I had to outsource. So there was no way around that. I had to find a medical professional that I could trust. That was my cousin.
Mhm.
She lived in Miami. I told her about this business model and she moved up here to work in this with me. So that trust I had to outsource. I trust her. I trust that she knows what she's doing when it comes to the medical stuff,
Mhm.
but also I'm learning as I go along. So now we have medication administration records that they're using each month to track on. I make those.
Mm.
So now I'm familiar with all of the different medications, the shorthands that they're using. So as their admin, I still get to learn a little bit about it. I'm never going to physically do it. I got certified to provide medication
Mhm.
and to do feedings as well. So I will take the trainings and occasionally I'll just watch them, ask a couple questions. So I'm learning as I go along, but I'm not learning to know how to do. I'm just learning to understand so that as I'm hearing and seeing things, I know what I'm looking at. But then if it comes to something that I just don't gonna be able to get because I'm not doing it,
Mhm.
my trust has been outsourced to her.
Yeah, but at the same time, the ongoing learning, it's time kinda what you're talking about at the beginning when you went down the rabbit hole of full education mode on real estate investing. You are showing a similar pattern of there's stuff to know, and I don't need to know it all, and I don't need to do it all, but understanding it and having a grasp of what's going on protects you. It helps you trust more because you can do a little bit of verification because you're not completely in the dark.
Right. So learn enough so that you're familiar and aware, but you don't need like performance efficiency in it.
Mhm. When you have excess capital, I did a podcast interview last year and it was not for real estate investing. It was for people who are building niche websites with those faceless businesses where you're selling something and then you get the website to the point where you can then sell the website. And they wanted me to come on and talk to their niche website clients about what to do with your money when you make a bunch of money. Because he said, we got young guys here, e-commerce guys here, they're blowing their money on stupid cars and they come away and they have maybe a couple of good exits on some websites and they come back and they're broke. So we really want to teach them a little bit more about investing in financial education so they're not just blowing their money on it. I thought that was a really fascinating topic to be talking about. It's like once you make your money, here's how you invest it, here's how you take care of it. And that really got me thinking outside my box. There are people who are good at stuff that I'm not good at, and I want to invest with them. And so learning that level of trust to say, I'm good at my lane, and the more I focus on my lane, the better I am at it, but that shrinks the amount of time that I can be a dilettante and know a bunch of different things. So, when you're looking at investing your capital, your excess capital, Is it all going back into your business? Are you because you said you don't want to purchase more rental houses. At a certain point, what are you investing in when your business is all full up?
Yep. So it's going back into the business, but I personally am not purchasing more rental like single family.
Mhm,
For me, all of the earnings from this business are the cash flow to get into commercial, larger assets that can be under institutional management. So now I want to focus on putting my money into truly passive assets. I'm looking at life insurance vehicles as well. The I'm looking at other businesses to invest in. So to me, none of the money from this business is for me to live off of,
mhm,
at least for the next 5 years. It is to take all of it and funnel it into things that can be truly passive sources of income.
mhm. What do those passive sources look like? Because I do invest some with other multifamily operators, even though that is my specialty. I know people who are way better at it than I am because I know what that should look like. I know what a really good multifamily operator business should look like. And when I find a great one, I'm like, I'm gonna just invest in that one. But there are certain things I don't know as much about that I also invest in because I don't want to become an expert at that thing. And I find somebody who I think is an expert and invest in that. So what do those passive opportunities look like for you?
So it definitely is larger commercial assets where there's multifamily storage units, but large enough where when I buy it, there's management in house.
Mhm.
So even though I'm not like putting my money into a fund with someone, I'm purchasing something that can self operate and I just have to manage the manager. To me,
Mhm.
that's still a level of passivity
Mhm.
that's good enough for me. Because what is that? Like a monthly check in to make sure that those operations are good. It's life insurance vehicles and then stock investment funds that I can put dollars into. Those are the three buckets I'm focused on right now.
Yeah, that's fairly similar to what I do. I don't find my ability to manage my stock investing is gonna make any difference. I'm not one of those gifted people who can beat the market with a very few people who could consistently.
Oh, I definitely am not. It's just I'll pick it. It's going in there, and that's it.
Yeah. Set or forget. I've got a couple of, index fund and a total market fund, and that's really the only place my stock money
Yeah.
because I just that's just not I not only am I not gifted in it, I'm not even interested in it, which is maybe why I'm not gifted. You have to be interested, get into it. And then investing in some things where we do run them like they are our businesses, like what you're talking about, but they're more of a hands-off model. Because there are some multifamily projects that are incredibly intensive because they're value adds, heavy value adds. It's almost like a new construction in a way, but there are others that are just cash flowing businesses, and we just come in and we just got a good deal on it, so we just run it like a business, and I don't have to do very much, and then there are others that I'm truly a limited partner. And I think that just has to do with my age. You just get to a certain point where you're starting to think like, I need to put more of this money in as passively as possible, and there's no more passive than limited partner on something. So it's like the stock market, but in real estate businesses. How do you see your investing changing over the next, say, 10 to 20 years? And I'm asking this from two directions. One, just your ability to stay really down and focused in a business when maybe you want to go live abroad or something like that as you're getting older in the next 20 years. And also from that sense of just thinking to yourself, like, what does life look like? How do things change over the next few years because you maybe have some bucket list things to do?
I actually try to look at life more on what do I want it to look like now versus how do I want to live later. So I try to keep a good balance of that now. Like I think this year, new business has started, new different business, different industry, and I've probably taken 20 trips in and out of the country. So I'm trying to live my bucket list like ongoing right now so that 10 years from now, I'm not like, oh, all of a sudden now I need to do all of these things. And because I need to do all of these things, I need to step away from the business. So it's more like a how do I shape my life now so that I'm having little bits of all of it? 2 weeks here or take a month a year to go live in another country now versus saving it for later. It's almost like using it as a reset where I'll take this vacation, but my laptop still works. So I try to set the business up so that anything that I need to do can travel with me on this laptop. So it doesn't matter whether I'm here or not. I don't know if that makes sense. So it's just more like, how do I live like I'm retired now, even though I'm still dabbling in things, and how do I set the businesses up so that I can do that 5 hours that I need to do wherever I am. So it's like building a physical business as if you were a digital nomad, if that makes sense.
So 4-hour work week style.
Yes, and let me tell you, I read that book, but when I read it, it was too soon because I didn't understand shit in it. And probably need to go back and read it. But when I initially read it, I just couldn't get it. I did not understand any of the concepts that he was trying to communicate. And maybe I was too far removed from the mindset or from the resources you actually had to have to pull that out. So I'm definitely going to circle back on that book to see if it makes sense to me
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, it was really life-changing for my husband. When I read it, it was like, "Yep." And when he read it, he was like, "Wait, what? You're supposed to dream about how you want life to be other than how it is right now?" Because his healthy sense of denial was like, "Everything's great."
Mm.
Not
Yeah.
definitely not a planner or a dreamer. And suddenly he started talking in a very different way after he read that book. And I think it really led to the lifestyle that we're living now because he felt like, "Oh, wait, you can do other stuff than just go to college, get a job, and take care of your kids." So he really found it to be, life-changing for him from that standpoint of lifestyle designs. And so I wanna shift topics a little bit here to what we were talking about before we started recording, and some of the morality issues that I struggle with when we're doing especially a property takeover, which we're doing right now, and the socioeconomic diversity that we deal with. And you mentioned something that I thought was interesting about how when you get to the point as a business person, when you can be more concerned about the people living in the properties than you are about maximizing profits, even for investors. And we talked about responsibility, like whose responsibility is it? And what does that look like? And where does that come from? Leaving money on the table to make sure that underprivileged people have a place to live, because I feel like a lot of times if we take over a really low end property, we are dealing with people who are on the verge of homelessness or struggle with temporary homelessness. And you said that that's not the kind of property you want to take over because those types of issues are not, it's just an arena that you don't want to get into. And I definitely feel very conflicted about that. So when you're choosing populations to serve, what does that look like in your business versus maybe how it's looking in my business?
I think because I'm short-term rental, the area that we have to be in has to look a lot different than a B or a C class, right? Someone's traveling into town for a certain experience or access to certain things. That's going to be more A, B class areas. So that's where we had to be because that's where short term works best, in
Mhm.
my opinion. The short term rental model in a C or D class, those are those pay by the night motel. It wasn't the product I was offering didn't fit in that area to begin with. Also, I didn't want to chase rent. I didn't want to deal with evictions or anything like that. So I went to areas where eviction ability to pay rent were not an issue.
Mhm.
And that's just where my portfolio is. Now it's a higher cost of entry to start in those areas, but because I started with my primary home
Mm.
and then I just moved out of that one and converted it to a rental, it made it a little more feasible for me to afford to get into that market. And then once I was there, I was able to continue to buy things because now I'm an expert in this area. I live here. I know the neighbors. I know who's selling and who wants to move on. So it made it easier for me to stay in those markets.
Mhm.
I think if I'd started real estate as an investor, not with my primary home, that would have been a little different. I would have had to get the thing that I could afford to get, and that would have been in those different areas. Having started with short term, I now have the privilege of taking advantage of the area that I'm in. And then if I'm called to, circling back to that market to try to offer a better product for people in those C and D class areas. But just the fact that I was doing short term alone pushed me out of being able to move material in those areas, period.
Yeah, I think that's a very similar story to where I started. I was just trying to find something that we could afford, that was profitable, that we could attract investors to. And now ugly properties do not attract investors. Our beautiful high-end A minus properties attract investors far better because they make beautiful photos and all of that. And they're a lot easier to run, a lot easier to run because they don't need a lot of construction and the property management doesn't have to be particularly gifted at collections or evictions. But at the same time, This is the first property I bought in like 2.5 years that I'm running. And like you said, I feel that calling. For a while, I was like, people start here, but they get out of this and they move into nicer properties that are easier to manage. But I found myself thinking a lot about it again as we're doing this takeover and the experience I've had with previous takeovers, that I want to be able to contribute or help in some way to this issue of borderline people kind of living on the edge of homelessness. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I feel like at this point, I can't really afford to do anything as a charity from my own point of view, but just making sure that people have a place to live that they can afford, that's safe. It doesn't have to be nice, if that makes sense. Just really battling that. Do you see that in your future at all? Because when we were talking about it before, you had made a couple of comments that we were talking about. What do you start to care about when money doesn't come the biggest deal in your life? When your mortgage is taken care of and all of that, and you don't have any debt, and you can start thinking outside that box. Like, where do you see your real estate business going, and where do you see your philanthropic efforts going?
Okay. And before I answer that, I just wanted to make a comment about what you said. I think some of the pressure that you have is because you have investors to satisfy. I think that you'll find it easier to solve the conflict that you have when it's just your deal
Mhm.
and you don't need it to hit a certain number or to make the maximum profit because you already have enough from other assets that are coming and you don't have any to answer to. So I think a lot of how I'm building my portfolio, I don't really fundraise or have any investors come on these deals. It may take me a little longer and I have to grow a little slower, but ultimately, I don't need to make all the money. So, like with the group home business currently, I can make a little less. One, because I don't need it. I don't have bills or expenses or debt. So I can focus more on making sure the stock has competitive salaries and benefits versus having to need that as something I need to build my lifestyle out of. So I think you'll get there when you are building things around the investors that you have to please, because that's always going to be the hurdle. Everybody wants to put their money into whatever they can make the most out of, and their values may not be aligning with what your values are becoming. So that'll be a shift. I think for me, I'm still trying to figure it out. Like I have no idea yet because I'm still a little bit in the building myself. What I'm seeing with this business now that my cousin has come here
Mhm.
and with the income that this produces, and now I can cast the net a little wider, and it's who do I know in my immediate orbit that I could give an opportunity to? Like, okay, my cousin has moved here. I reached out to all of my family that were medical
Mhm.
adjacent to see if they wanted to come and work in this business with me. So right now I'm focused on who's in my immediate orbit that I can provide an opportunity to or that I can impact in that way. Think I have yet to think about a grander scale of change. It's more so changing me right now. I'm like, okay, who's next? And right now it's my cousin, but then that trickles down to her kids. Are there any other family members or anybody else that I can impact or any friends that have interests? What about my neighbors? So it's more of an organic, like, this is what's coming up at the time, and these are the opportunities presenting themselves for me to have an impact versus I have an intrinsic desire to affect change in a certain way. So I don't know if that comes later for me, but it hasn't come yet.
It's an interesting way to look at it because I feel overwhelmed by the scope of what I'm seeing. It's not just my properties, it's when we're shopping comps, when we're looking at properties we end up not buying. There's this entire world of poverty that's overwhelming, and all I can do is just keep my business together. But
Mm,
where you're looking at it is maybe a little bit more of an empowering standpoint because you're thinking how we should all be thinking, one person at a time, one thing at a time, and gradually expanding that circle of influence and that circle of ability to have an impact as you help one person at a time and increase your resources to be able to go outside of that. Because sometimes when you feel that overwhelm, you just feel powerless to do anything about it. And so you're hanging on to that optimism and staying focused where it matters, which is on that one person. Who's next?
that's the most that I can handle. I think that I would probably go crazy if I just decided that I wanted to go back to the neighborhood, save everybody in it. That would extremely overwhelming. And like no one person can. What you can do first is get yourself together.
Mhm.
And then you can change your environment and affect the people that are in that environment. And then as you get a little more resources, you can be selective. Say, hey, I see something in you. Come here, let me teach you something. But I'm still so early in being an investor and having these businesses that I'm just not that far along yet where I'm looking at this grander scale, like, how can I come in and change this whole neighborhood? But also, I don't know that I would ever go to that because it is a lot. And I don't know if it's different for me because I came from that. And there's a little bit of onus of, okay, I came out, someone else can come out, but how do I expose them to resources? So I think one of the things is participating in podcasts and being a face and a voice that someone else who looks like me can see and know, okay, she came from where I came from. So if she could do this, I could. And I think for the last 2 years, that's been my focus. Just how do I just being visible, being present, and being someone could see and know that if I did it and we have similar backgrounds or resources, they could too. Just if I had an example growing up, how much easier would it have been for me? So right now, I'm just the best that I can do is the best that I can do and let that be visible to someone else.
Yeah, I feel like I identify sometimes I like, I wanna help other stay-at-home moms become financially free because I was a stay-at-home mom, and so that's really who I identify with, and
Mhm.
seeing other people who look like you or who came from the same background with similar resources, like you were saying, there's power there when you identify with somebody's journey and you see yourself in that person. Again, it's like nobody's better than me. Look, this person did it. I can do it too. I definitely feel a little bit more beholden to people with a similar background because you know that there's that identification with your
Mhm.
journey.
Right. And you can do that. You just waking up every day and living your life and going out your business about your business is impactful because someone else can see that. You sharing it is impactful. I think sometimes we're not fair to ourselves when we try to put like the weight of the world, like, how do I change this whole thing? Maybe you can't, right? I mean, how long has this whole thing been existing? And all of the people before you that wanted to change that whole thing couldn't. But what people have been doing is gradually changing themselves and their families and the generations to come. And it's just all at 1 foot at a time just take the next step. So I try not to overwhelm myself with things that I can't control and focus on what I can.
One of my residents to me years ago, I think it might have been the first property we were taking over, and it was in pretty rough shape. And she said that she had lived in this place when she was a kid and had moved back as an adult and urged us to look at some of the environmental hazards that living in buildings creates for people living in poverty. She said, I grew up here chewing lead paint off of the windowsills, and I see a lot of lead toxicity in some of the lower income communities that she's lived in. She says, "I see a lot of long-term health complications from growing up in buildings that are full of mold." Or in some one building we took over, there was literally raw sewage, coming out of the pipes and dripping into people's kitchens, so we had to fix all those pipes. And she really made me aware of the health of the buildings that people are living in, and so that almost gave me like, "Okay, this I can do. I can make sure that there's no exposure to lead paint, asbestos, sewage, mold. I can really make sure that these buildings are safer to live in from an environmental standpoint because that I can do. I own this building, and that was part of our business plan already anyway, and we don't have to raise
Mhm.
rent a whole lot to be able to fix some of these basic, life and health situations, and so for me, I just started there, and then it started to come out of there as I felt more empowered from just that standpoint. Like you said, it wasn't exactly one person at a time, but maybe more one property at a time and what we
Mhm.
control, so that's a great way of looking at it.
Yep, definitely. I'm excited to see where that goes and what you end up doing.
Yeah, me too, because right now I still feel like I'm figuring out how to get my own oxygen mask on because we got a lot of kids. Trying to trying to take care of that first. But yeah, these kinds of thoughts I think are the kinds of thoughts you can start to have when you're not so worried about paying your debt, paying your mortgage and all that. I think you were really living a lifestyle where you've put that front and center and become a voice for others to be able to start thinking those same kinds of questions. What can I do? What am I capable of? And how can I empower other people to be capable of similar types of things. So appreciate you sharing your story, your aspirations, your dreams, and giving us so many good, like nitty gritty tips on how to run a business well, even if you're not an expert at every little aspect of the business, getting yourself out of that mindset. How do people either get in touch with you or find out more about you after the show ends? What type of person would you really like to be able to communicate with, either directly or indirectly?
So I can be reached on all social media at Fearless and Free Fly, but primarily on Instagram. And we recently launched a YouTube series that's trying to tracking the day to day of building this assisted living business. So check us out on YouTube at Fearless and Free Fly FI, and follow and watch our YouTube show, and also follow us on Instagram. That would be ideal. And it's for anybody with interest in seeing something different, getting exposure to something different, learning about lifestyle hacks, because we do implement a lot of our travel hacks and tips in there so that we can live a little while we do all this work. Yeah, I guess it's for anyone. Anybody who wants to know what shenanigans we're up to here.
Thank you. Definitely enjoying your content. Would love to plan some sort of, I don't know, let's have a conversation after the show because while we're still in Orlando, to be able to maybe do something together. Because my channel is similar in the sense that we look at the adventures that we're going on and some of the fun things that we're doing, but also mixing in that financial education in there as well with here's how we did it, here's how you did it, not just a podcast, but also just educational, free educational videos. So I love what you're doing. I love your story. I find it really inspiring and I really appreciate meeting you, knowing you. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to it. We definitely have to do something before you leave us. So let's connect.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Oh, wow. As soon as I pressed stop, she started laughing. She's, wow, I'm sweating. That was so hard to sit still and only think about one thing for such a long period of time. And that describes so many of the guests that I have on my show, including myself, where we are just running a million miles a minute and just having fun with life and just trying to figure stuff out as we go along. So if you see yourself in my story or in Antoinette's story, we would love to talk to you after the show. Please, we get together every Monday night at our investing club at riseclubcapital.com, where we network, have education, and do joint venture deals together. And if you want to invest with us in the deals that we're actually doing for our early retirement and passive income, come check it out on partnerwithrise.com, where you can sign up for our private investor portal and invest together with us, where we invest together in diverse cash flowing real estate assets. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend some time with me. And please reach out after the show so that I can hear about your next passive income adventure.